Hey, what's up? Andrew Kramer here, and welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today, we're going to take a look at Element 3D and some of the more advanced options inside of the group array. So that includes the particle look as well as the particle replicator. So we're going to talk about how some of those options can affect what you're creating, and you can do some really interesting things. Now, I'm going to try to explain everything casually as we go through it and just talk about the different things as we run across. So hopefully you can start picking up on some of these more interesting and advanced features. All right, so let's go and get started. We're going to be taking a look at Group 1. Now, one thing you'll notice is that there are 5 groups, and I'll tell you that each one of these groups are exactly the same. So the way Element works is that we go inside the scene setup. And inside of here, we can import a 3D object, or we can choose one from our model browser. In this case, I've loaded the sphere low quality, and that's in the primitives folder. We'll go down here. And we've got a couple of different options. We've got the sphere HD, and the sphere low. So the HD one is very smooth. So if we go to wireframe, it's got a lot of polygons. Now the low one only has a few. The benefit here is that if we use the low polygon, it'll render faster. So when I'm doing something like a particle array where all of my objects are really small, like in this case where I have 5,000 of them, I don't need to use a very high poly model. Because if you look at this closely, you can't really see any of those edges because the objects are really small. But let's jump back in and talk about some of the other ways to set this up. First thing we'll notice is that our object is on group number 1. And what that means is that this object is going to show up in the group 1 replicator. And by the way, if you roll over stuff, you'll see a little bit of information about that particular feature. So one thing to notice is that you can turn on objects into multiple groups. So you can actually put the same object into other groups. So if I hit OK, that object on group 3, I can move it around here, and you see it in the background there. So it's interacting with the other groups, and the benefit here is that I have specific control over the way that this object looks. So I can move it to a different location, I can change the look of the replicator, and have my own custom options over a completely separate group. But let's go and just undo that. All right, let's go and take a look at setting this up from scratch. Now I've got my lighting and my ambient occlusion on already, and the way I've set that up is I've gone to the ambient occlusion, turned it on, and you can see it just adds a little bit of shading, and you can play with the radius and the intensity to change the look of that. And there's some other options that we'll get into in another tutorial. But what I'm going to do is come up to the group, and I'm going to go down to the copy paste group, and I'm just going to choose reset. And that way everything's back to normal. I've got my one particle that's on group 1 here, and we're just going to hit OK. So just like we loaded a single object. Now I'm going to go into the particle look, and the cool thing about using a white material is that the color tint effect will allow us to change the color pretty easily. So just, we'll do like a red material here, and then we'll hit OK. And the benefit here is that we can keyframe this value, so we could do some fun things with the color by using this one value. Now we've got basic things here like size. We've got size random, which will affect multiple particles from the replicator, and some other options that we'll get into in a second. But let's turn the size actually down kind of low, and let's go to the particle replicator. So let's go and talk about it. So we've got the particle count. We can turn this up, but the replicator shape is a point. So we don't see the particles unless we did something like scatter them, and then we could start to see the different pieces. We could turn this particle count up, and we could probably do something interesting with this. We could also use some of these pre-built ones like a plane, and if we turn the scatter value down, we can see what that looks like, and then we could turn the scale of the shape up. So start thinking about building these structures with the particle replicator. And at first, it might seem like there's just a bunch of settings and some of them seem like they're the same. What does it all mean? Well, let's go and talk about some of the more common ones, and then we'll get into some of the more specific ones. So the scale shape allows you to resize whatever the replicator shape is. So if we change it to a sphere, we might want to scale that up and move it around a bit. We've also got the position, and the position is basically the replicator, or sort of like the emitter position, except Element doesn't emit particles, it just creates them. But this can be tied to a null object and allowed to be moved around. But this basically gives you the control to put these objects wherever you need. Now, when you use some of the specific options, you also see something called shape options. And the shape options just offer a little bit more control over that basic replicator shape. So if we go in there, they're pretty much the same for all of the options that have it, and allows you to do multiple layers. So I could say use the plane, and I can turn the layers up to say 3. And so now I've got 3 layers of particles. Now these are going to use the same particle count. So whatever value this is will be here. So if there's only a few, it automatically distributes them evenly into each of the groups. Now we have layer offset, so we can bring them a little closer together. We've also got layer distribution. Now this works a little bit differently. What this does is allows particles to be distributed almost a little bit more weighted. So you see how there's fewer particles on this bottom one and then there's more on the top? Now this option might be more helpful for a sphere where the outside may require more particles and the inside circles maybe require less particles since it's smaller. So let's set the distribution back to 1 and the layers back to 1. And let's go ahead and change it to a sphere. So we're just running through some of the features here. Let's turn the particle count up and scale the shape down a touch. Now another option here is the distribution. Right now it's set to automatic. So what that means is whatever the particle count is, it'll automatically distribute it into the shape as best it can to fit it into that structure. Now we can also change it to set rows, and this will let you set a specific amount of rows. So there's definitely some fun things you could do with this. And imagine if we come down here to something like the position noise, turn that up, we can really start to create some interesting looks. But we'll jump more into that in just a few minutes. But let's take a look at the rest of the replicator shape types. So we've got things like 3D grid. So a 3D grid is just a simple grid that allows you to control how many particles are in the structure. So we could turn this up, say, 25 by 25 by 25, and scale the array up. This is getting probably too high. Let's do 10 by 10 by 10. And we can definitely do some cool stuff with this because, you have control over how these look, and you could do more or less distribution and, even play around with, the position noise as well for something like this. And, there's some fun options there. That's the 3D grid. We've also got a ring, which is, obviously pretty straightforward. And then there's a mode called layer. So layer lets you use a layer's alpha as the replicator shape. So for example, I could create a new solid and then take the mask tool and just draw, any kind of a shape that I wanted. This could be an image that has some alpha. And what I need to do is just pre-compose it first. So layer, pre-compose, it's at the bottom. And we're going to pre-compose by moving all attributes. And then we'll call this array. And then we'll shut that layer off. And then we'll go back to element, and we'll set the replicator shape to the layer mode. And then we can choose a custom layer. So we'll choose the array layer that we just created. And now we have sort of a 3D representation of that using particles. We can increase the particle count. We could increase it and maybe even bring the size of the particles down, and do some interesting stuff there. And again, we could use some of the various effects like position noise to create, again, some very interesting looks using element. So not sure what this is, but it looks pretty delicious. You could turn that particle count down quite a bit and really, really do some fun stuff with this. So Okay, so finally we've got one other option. So let's turn that setting down, the position noise. All right, so finally we can even use a 3D object as a replicator shape. So how do we do that? Well, first we have to go into the scene setup so that we can access some of our 3D models. And what you need to do is load a 3D model that you want to use, and check this out. There's a button here. This creates the atom type, and this creates the replicator type. So if we turn that on, so we're now going to use this object as the replicator shape for group 1. So now if we hit OK, and by the way, where are the particles going to be generated? Well, change this to point cloud and you can see. So basically on all of the vertexes where the polygons cross are where each particle is going to be created. So it's going to be created in a fashion similar to this. So let's go and hit OK. And then we're going to change our replicator shape from layer to 3D object. All right, so let's scale the shape down a touch. Now, one thing to note is that there's no control over particle count. It uses the object's vertexes, but there is an object percentage. So if we turn this up, we can see the entire object being recreated. Now that that's set up, we can go in and do some of these different things, such as scatter, and that'll move the particles randomly. We can also go into the particle look, and again, we could turn up the size random, and that'll create, an interesting look. We can also go back to the replicator shape, and let's talk about some of these different options. So first, we have the scale. So that's going to scale our object. Now notice that the particle size stays the same, just the object replicator gets a bit bigger. We can also scale XYZ, and this allows you to sort of stretch out the replicator, but again, not stretching out the particles. Rotation. The rotation is going to affect the replicator. So the rotation is going to turn the entire object around, and you can do some fun stuff with that. Now, this might be a little difficult to see with this particular object, but what it does is pushes the particles away from the surface and just allows a little bit more interaction with away from the surface. And I can also even turn up the surface randomness and do some fun stuff with that. And there's some specific creative uses for that. Let me just show you one really quick since we're just freestyling here. Let me go into the scene setup. And I'm going to go to my demo. I'm going to add another stopwatch into my scene, okay? And we'll switch off point cloud. And I think it's just too reflective. Let me turn the intensity of the reflection down. Now, what I'm going to do is leave it as a particle and put it onto group 2. And then I'm going to hit OK. The scale of the shape is currently 14. So if I go to group 2, turn the size up to 14, as long as the object is in the same place, what you're going to see is the particle replicator is creating its points right on the object. So this could lead to some quite interesting things, as you can imagine. And more specifically, if you go into the particle replicator, the surface offset now allows you to bring things on and off the surface relative to the actual model. Now keep in mind, if your 3D object has a ton of points, you might end up crashing your GPU. So try not to load a model that has hundreds of thousands of polygons, and you can look at that information right here. So here, this object has 38,000 vertices, and that's quite a bit. So to give you an idea, that's 38,000 particles when this is set to 100%. It's pretty serious amount of particles. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to overload your GPU. Now let's just shut off our clock here. And back into the particle look, we could start doing some more stuff. So let's just keep this particle type up and let's look at some of the other options. So that's surface offset. That's really handy. We talked about scatter. Scatter works by just randomly displacing the position. And we also have scatter XYZ. Obviously that's cool because you can scatter in a certain direction. So if you want everything to shoot out this way and then come together, that could be fun. Same thing with the X. Now, position noise, which we took a look at. Now, position noise works based on the position of objects. So if we turn the amount up, we're going to see some crazy warped clocks, and we can change the noise size. The smaller the size of the noise, the more wobbly it looks, or the softer it is. We can also add a little bit of evolution, which will animate it. So if we, added an expression like alt-clicked and said time star, I don't know, 15, we're going to create maybe a little bit more than that. Let me lose my keyframes for my camera really quick. There we go. So there we go. We've got this crazy clock. You can create your own Salvador Dali persistence of memory, illusion. That's a lot of fun. Let's see. Can control the amount, and you can keyframe this and animate it, and you can have it come in and come out and fly around. Like, you could really do some fascinating stuff. And now imagine, I don't want to blow your mind here, but let's turn on depth of field, and things are going to get pretty wild. Obviously, it's going to slow down when you have the depth of field on, but the possibilities with this replicator system are quite powerful. And remember, these animate too, so you can really create some dynamic stuff here. The truth is, this plugin was designed to be a particle replicator, and then we realized, that we could just do a lot more. And that's why there's been a little bit more focus on individual objects, that look really good. But the particle replicator is actually one of the main things we designed the plugin for, and so it's got a lot of great capabilities. Let's go ahead and shut the depth of field off. I just thought of one other thing, because we're freestyling here. Let me jump into the scene setup. I want to show you something kind of cool. So right now we're using this sphere as our object, right? And it's on group 1. Well, I'm going to uncheck it from group 1. So right now there's no objects on group 1, so we're not going to render anything since group 1 is empty. And that's also handy, by the way, is that if you don't want to use something, you don't have to delete it. If you've changed the settings, set it up, just turn it off. It'll stay in your scene, it just won't render. Now, I'm going to come over here to the motion design pack, which is a separate pack, but I'm going to use it just to illustrate something. I'm going to come in here. We've got machine parts. So some fun stuff in here. And I'm just going to click on one of them. So now if we go to the top here, it's set to group 1. I can even take that shader that we used originally, which is this black metal one. I could even rename it by double clicking on it and just call this white metal and hit OK. And that way we know that's the one we want. And let's come up here to the gear and throw that on there. I'm going to hit OK. So now I've got about a gazillion gears all floating around, and I can even turn on depth of field. Now remember, this object has a ton more polygons than our sphere, so it's going to render a lot slower, but you can see it looks pretty dang cool. And we can play around with the depth of field options and things like that as well. But let me take this a little bit further. Let me jump back into Element, and let's look in the gears here. And let's add another object. So let's add this machine part here, whatever this is. Let's add, one of these simple gears and maybe this round gear. And let's take our white metal and drop that on there. Take this gear, throw that on there. Machine part, throw that on there. So what I've done now is I've added 5 objects. Say 1, 2, 3, 4 objects. And they're all on group 1. So what's going to happen when I hit OK? Well, basically, all of the objects are going to randomly be chosen and added into our scene. So now we're starting to just get insane, and the animation's moving, and I might even want to slow that down because this is one heck of a machine. Those gears are really working hard. Sorry. There we go. All right, so now we've got 3-dimensional objects that are doing some really fascinating stuff. All right, let's go and turn the position noise down. So we'll start bringing this down, and just imagine if you were actually creating an animation like this, where everything's coming back together. Oh, here we've got our clock again. And our clock is made up of a bunch of these objects. Now, let's talk about dealing with this. So we've got gears, and we've also got this machine part. And let's say I don't like the orientation of these objects. Well, here's a few things that you can do to adjust the orientation. So we'll go into the scene, The machine part is just not the right direction. So what I'm going to do is click on it, come in here, machine part. So it's rotated the wrong way. I want it to be flat towards the camera. So if you click on the object, we have some rotation options here. And we can say set this to 90 degrees. And so now it is facing us like the other gears. And you can rotate this any way you want, depending on what kind of object it is. And then we hit OK. And so now all of those objects are facing away from the surface of our 3D object. Now, to make that a little bit more clear, I'm going to change the object type to a sphere. And I'm going to bring the count down to say 500 and the scale of this shape down as well. So sorry, the craziness had to end. And here we are back to a somewhat more reasonable object. Now, you can see that all of the particles or all the 3D objects are pointed away from the 3D surface of the sphere. So if we come to the particle look, we have rotation, and then inside here we have orientation, and it's set to along the surface. So that's going to use the 3D object or the replicator shape as a surface to push the particles away from. So if we set it to face camera, all the objects will look at us, and if we set it to fixed, this will be just an absolute value. So you'll see if we turn the side here, they're all pointed the same way, and then we could go in and we could actually rotate them. Now, the difference between the particle look and the particle replicator is that the particle look controls the individual particles. So I can rotate the particles individually. Now, the particle replicator, the rotation controls the entire group shape. So that's, the basic idea and how to kind of think about which setting is where. And, we've got a couple of other interesting options in here. So we've got rotation randomization, and that allows you to randomize on a particular axis, and that's pretty useful. We've got randomize angle. This one's kind of hard to explain, but basically it creates a random angle based on a multiplier. And may not make sense here, but basically if I set it to 90 degrees, you'll see that all the objects choose a 90-degree angle. So like this one's facing this way, this one's facing this way, and they're going to randomly choose a 90-degree angle to work from. And it could be useful, in this case, just to keep things uniform. Maybe you don't want just the random rotation look where everything is just scattered everywhere. So that can be useful. And then we've got rotation noise. Now, this is similar to position noise, which means the rotation is based on the position of the object. So if we turn it up here, we could turn up the evolution. And what's nice about this is we can animate the evolution. So what's nice about this is we can add a little bit of rotation and life to our particles even though they're static. And likewise, if we were to turn up the position noise, so again, I know it seems like there's a lot of stuff and it'll just take a little while to know where things are. But the position noise here, if we turn that up just a touch, then we're going to see just the particles moving around just a little bit and wobbling and rotating. And if we turn up the scale of the noise, it'll seem more like they're independently floating in 3D space. So the amount is how much. The noise scale is the frequency, essentially. Like this is a lot more wobbly. But remember, there's not any physics, but you can really create some fun, fascinating looks. Now, the multi-object is a little bit more advanced, and we'll talk about that some more. Basically, it allows you to animate objects that have pieces, like, for example, this watch model that's made up of multiple individual pieces. And the multi-object system allows you to animate them without having to actually animate all of the pieces individually. So we'll talk about that a little bit more specifically because some really cool stuff in there. But hopefully this gives you a nice idea of how the particle replicator works and some of the really creative possibilities that lie within it, even just by using simple 3D objects. So anyways, check out the plugin, a lot of great features. My name is Andrew Kramer, and we will see you next time.